The Sumerian corporations were monopolies, legitimized by heaven, somewhat like medieval monasteries or the fiefdoms of televangelists. Their way of life, however, was far from monastic, as the temple harlotry in Gilgamesh implies. The Sumerian priests may have been sincere believers in their gods, although ancient people were not exempt from manipulations of credulity. At their worst, they were the world's first racketeers, running the eternal money spinners, protection, booze, and girls. The protection initially offered by the priesthood was from the forces of nature and the wrath of the gods. But as the Sumerian city-states grew, they began to make war amongst themselves. Their wealth also drew raids from mountain and desert folk who, though less civilized, were often better armed. So it was that Uruk, at 1,100 acres and 50,000 people, by far the biggest Sumerian city, became strong-walled, the wonder of its world. Having invented irrigation, the city, the corporation, and writing, Sumer added professional soldiers and hereditary kings. The kings moved out of the temples and into palaces of their own, where they forged personal links with divinity, claiming godly status by virtue of descent from heaven, a notion that would appear in many cultures and endure into modern times as divine right. With kingship came new uses for writing, dynastic history and propaganda, the exaltation of a single individual. As Bertolt Brecht dryly reflects in his poem about a worker looking at the pyramids, "The books are filled with names of kings. Was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? Young Alexander conquered India. He alone?" By 2500 BC, the days of collective landholding by city and corporation were gone. The fields now belonged to lords and great families. The Sumerian populace became serfs and sharecroppers, and beneath them was a permanent underclass of slaves, a feature of Western civilization that would last until the 19th century after Christ. States arrogate to themselves the power of coercive violence, the right to crack the whip, execute prisoners, send young men to the battlefield. From this stems that venomous bloom which J.M. Coetzee has called, in his extraordinary novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, the black flower of civilization. Torture, wrongful imprisonment, violence for display, the forging of might into right. Among the privileges of god-kings in Sumer and elsewhere were various styles of human sacrifice, including the right to take people along for company beyond the grave. The king's tomb at Ur, known to archaeologists as the Death Pit, contains the first mass burial of royal concubines, retainers, and the workers who built it. About 75 men and women all told, their skeletons nested like spoons in a drawer. Around the world, from Egypt and Greece to China and Mexico, the idea that the king's life was worth so much more than other people's would take root again and again. The builders who seal the tomb are killed on the spot by guards, who are themselves killed by other guards, and so on, until the late king's executors deem his resting place sufficiently honored and secure. Throughout the ancient world, rulers performed the ultimate political theater, public sacrifice of captives. As a 19th century Ashanti king in what is now Ghana candidly told the British, "If I were to abolish human sacrifice, I should deprive myself of one of the most effectual means of keeping the people in subjection." The British, who at that time were tying Indian mutineers across the mouths of cannon and blowing them in half, scarcely needed such advice. Each culture has its codes and sensibilities. In Mexico, the Spanish conquistadors were appalled by the ritual slaughter of prisoners done with a blade to the heart. But the Aztecs were equally horrified when they saw the Spaniards burn people alive. Violence is as old as man, but civilizations commit it with a deliberation that lends it special horror. In the death pit of Ur, we can foreglimpse all the mass graves to come, down through 5,000 years to Bosnia and Rwanda, and full circle to the Iraq of Saddam Hussein, who, like the ancient kings of that land, had his name stamped on the bricks used to rebuild their monuments. In civilization, unlike the hunter-gatherer life, it has always mattered who you are. We have come a very long way from extended families round a Stone Age campfire to societies in which some people are demigods and others nothing more than flesh to be worked to death or buried in their betters' tombs.
I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is Ideas. From the Place Riel Theatre at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, you're listening to Fool's Paradise, the third of Ronald Wright's 2004 Massey Lectures, a short history of progress.
Until mechanized farming began, food growers, whether peasants or slaves, outnumbered the elite and professionals who lived off their surplus by about 10 to 1. The Massey's reward for this was usually little more than bare survival, alleviated by the consolations of custom and belief. If they were lucky, they might belong to a state which, in enlightened self-interest, would give public assistance in times of crop failure. The ideal of the leader as provider and the wealthy as open-handed survived to some extent and can be traced in many languages. Our word lord comes from the Old English hlaford or loaf ward, he who guarded the bread supply and was expected to share it out. One of an Inca emperor's many titles was Wakchakuyach, he who cares for the bereft. The chiefs of Hawaii were warned by their elders against hoarding food or goods for themselves. The hands of the ari'i must always be open. On this rests your prestige. And it was said of the Chinese emperors that their first duty was to feed their people. The truth is that China, like most agrarian societies, lurched from famine to famine well into modern times. Effective food security was as rare in the past as it is today in the Third World. Most ancient states did not have the storage or transport to deal with anything worse than a minor crisis. The Incas and Romans were probably the best at famine relief, and it's no coincidence that both were very large empires spread over several climatic zones with good warehousing, roads, and sea lanes. A small civilization, such as Sumer, dependent on a single ecosystem and without high ground, was especially vulnerable to flood and drought. Such disasters were viewed then as now as acts of God or gods. Like us, the Sumerians were only dimly aware that human activity was also to blame. Floodplains will always flood, sooner or later. But deforestation of the great watersheds upstream made inundations much fiercer and more deadly than they would otherwise have been. Woodlands, with their carpet of undergrowth, mosses, and loam, worked like great sponges, soaking up rainfall and allowing it to filter slowly into the earth below. Trees drink up water and breathe it into the air. But wherever primeval woods and their soils have been destroyed by cutting, burning, overgrazing, or plowing, the bare subsoil bakes hard in dry weather and acts like a roof in wet. The result is flash floods, sometimes carrying such heavy loads of silt and gravel that they rush from steep ravines like liquid concrete. Staggering alluvial forces are at work in Mesopotamia. In the 5,000 years since Sumerian records began, the twin rivers have filled in 80 miles of the Persian Gulf. Iraq's second city of Basra was open sea in ancient times. The plains of Sumer are more than 200 miles wide. In times of an unusually great flood, the kind that might happen once a century or so, a king standing in the rain on a temple softening under his feet would see nothing but water between himself and the rim of the sky. Not only did Adam and Eve drive themselves from Eden, but the eroded landscape they left behind set the stage for Noah's flood. In the early days, when the city mounds were low and easily swamped, the only refuge would have been a boat. The Sumerian version of the legend, told in the first person by a man named Utnapishtim, has the ring of real events, with vivid detail on freak weather and broken dams. In it, we may see not only the forerunner of the biblical story, but the first eyewitness account of a man-made environmental catastrophe. In those days, the world teemed, the people multiplied. Enlil heard the clamor, and he said to the gods in council, "The uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible." So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. Enlil, the storm god, is the instigator. Others, including Ishtar, goddess of love and queen of heaven, a less virginal forerunner of Mary, go along with it. But Ea, the god of wisdom, warns Utnapishtim in a dream. "Tear down your house, I say, and build a boat. Abandon possessions and look for life. Take up into the boat the seed of all living creatures." The time was fulfilled. The evening came. The rider of the storm sent down the rain. I looked out at the weather, and it was terrible. So I, too, boarded the boat and battened her down. With the first light of dawn, a black cloud came from the horizon. It thundered within, where Adad, lord of the storm, was riding. Then the gods of the abyss rose up. Nergal pulled out the dams of the nether waters. Ninurta, the warlord, threw down the dikes. And the god of the storm turned daylight to darkness when he smashed the land like a cup. For 6 days and nights the winds blew. Torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. When the 7th day dawned, I looked at the face of the world, and there was silence. All mankind was turned to clay. The surface of the sea stretched as flat as a rooftop. I opened a hatch, and the light fell on my face. Then I bowed down low. I sat down and I wept, for on every side was the waste of water. Utnapishtim sends out birds to find land. When the waters start to go down, he burns incense to draw down the gods. But his wording hints that the real attraction is the stench of corpses in the mud. The gods, he says, gathered like flies over the sacrifice. Unlike Jehovah with his rainbow, the Sumerian deities make no promises. Ishtar fingers her necklace and says only that she will remember. Enlil sees the ark and gets angry. Has any of these mortals escaped? Not one was to have survived. Then Ea, who had given the warning and saved the animals, upbraids Enlil for what he has done and begins a doleful chant. Would that a lion had ravaged mankind rather than the flood. Would that famine had wasted the world rather than the flood. Ea should have been more careful what he wished for. When Sir Leonard Woolley excavated in Sumer between the world wars, he wrote, "To those who have seen the Mesopotamian desert, the ancient world seems well nigh incredible. So complete is the contrast between past and present. Why, if Ur was an empire's capital, if Sumer was once a vast granary, has the population dwindled to nothing, the very soil lost its virtue?" Woolley's question has a one-word answer: salt.